Okay, so welcome to what, week five, tutorial five. Anyone who's normally watching this later or here live and sees that I'm not Vicky, I'm Declan. I'm taking over the last two tutorials in this time slot, so this week and next week. Just like a workload thing on her part, she's asked me to step in. I've been teaching like the running the tutorials at a different time slot as part of this, so all up to date with it. You're not gonna miss out on anything here. So, this week we're looking at kind of, I guess maybe the more invisible parts of learning, or like the bits that are maybe a little bit less, like less apparent. So we'll be looking at things like metacognition in particular, as well as self-regulated learning, which will be probably something that I think all of you will latch onto quite a bit, considering it's essentially part of how you would learn it as adults at a university as well. So, when we look at the idea of self-regulated learning and metacognition, these are kind of the two things that sit right at the heart of how people learn, not just like at whatever age group they are, but across our lifespans. So they're skills that support not just future students that you'll have when teaching or any students that you work with in any teaching capacity now, but your own learning as well. So whether you're studying education or if you have previously or are studying other areas, like if you were to study nursing, science, arts, mathematics, anything you're studying, these kind of skills are, especially at a university, are basically paramount to I guess, good outcomes in learning to actually having learned information. So we're going to look at the outcomes here that we're aiming to get across for you. And mainly we're looking at explaining things like how learning outcomes goals help structure and evaluate learning. We're looking at applying SRL, so self-regulated learning principles, to supporting planning, monitoring, and reflection. We're going to look at like analyzing how motivation influences engagement. And we're going to look at developing strategies that combine goal setting, SRL, and motivation to foster lifelong learning. And why we've got goal settings in there is that like goal setting has like increasingly over the years been linked to like learning outcomes to achievement to like mastery of things. So breaking it up into like the right type of goals is a big way that we learn how to learn how to learn, how we accomplish learning, but also how we just accomplish in general. Um, so it's completely focused on the tutorial today, at least, completely focused on like the first half of this. So understanding self-regulated learning and metacognition, and particularly through your own experience as a teacher, but also as a student. Um, so basically, the first thing I wanted to check in with you both that are here and anyone listening is, have you looked at the like the unit content? Have you gone through the module content for this week? Up to date with the readings? Cool. Just want a starting point of how thoroughly have we gone through the information, just so when we start talking about terms and start saying things like metacognition and self-regulated learning, that you are like following along with that. You're not sitting there going, never heard of these terms before. Cool. So to get you kind of thinking about that, if we go into the Menti sort of thing, and I know that at least today live in the tutorial, there's only two of us, so welcome to put it in the chat or put on the microphone if it's easy to answer this. But um, we're going to start looking at your own learning habits. So when you learn something new, or when you begin learning, what do you actually do first? What do you usually do first? So you can type it in the chat, put on the microphone and talk about it. What is it that when you're learning something, what do you usually do first? And this can be whatever step that is, feel as broad as you like. What does it look like? What is the first thing that you do? Yep. Start looking at what you have to do to get an overview. Absolutely. And that's the kind of answers we are
Try
looking
to
for, I think.
break
Yep.
it into small steps to understand the whole process.
Yeah, break into small steps, absolutely. And there's both great answers. I think those are better answers than I have. I think probably one of the first things that I do when I need to learn something new is I might begin just by Googling it. I might start as simply as going, let's Google it, search, and like find a starting point. Um, I know like some people will sit there and say they avoided it first. But yeah, we start breaking it down. We start getting an overview, seeing what we do. What else do we do as part of that like beginning process? Is the main thing like getting an overview? Is it breaking it down into steps? Are there other parts of that? I don't know that this is like the two people here specifically the first thing you both do, but are there other things you know other people do as a starting point? Other things that you've done in the past, just to kind of keep the discussion going? What are some of the tendencies in how we or other people around us start? Yeah, make sure the space is conducive. Yeah. It can also just to like get out that there's no right or wrong answers. It doesn't have to be like all the good things. It can also be like maybe you panic, maybe you get overwhelmed by it. And if that's a starting point, that's also good to know. It's just about noticing those natural tendencies. Because there are some bits of information that if you were to open up and go, okay, let's learn, say, if you're going to try and learn like quantum mechanics or physics, are you going to immediately know where to begin? So for instance, I have a friend who about a year or two ago finished a PhD in near Earth space physics. And frankly, if I had to try and learn what he knows, I think I would genuinely start with just panic or feeling overwhelmed and go, I don't know how I'm ever going to know any of that. Yep, I like the response we've got there. If I feel anxiety, I leave it and come back when feeling ready. Absolutely. So, like, what we're trying to get at with as activity and talking this through is that it shows pretty immediately just that there are differences in how we begin to learn. That some of us jump it straight in. Some of us will like gather information. We might ask help for others. We might make the space conducive. Might break it down into goals. We might kind of get an overview of what we're looking at doing. And you might also feel stuck in it. You might feel anxiety. You might kind of procrastinate. So there's like a lot of different ways that this could go. And, if we had more students live in the tutorial, we might get more and more of those. But just kind of getting a bit of an overview of the depth and breadth of like these kind of responses basically gives you that entry point into what self-regulated learning is, because it just starts with that sort of awareness. We've got to start with noticing. How do we approach like a learning situation? How do we go about it? And that even comes down to like as university students, as people in a university here, how are we doing? What are our ways of doing it in a self-regulated way? Recently, I did a 5-year goal to help get through a 2-year master's. Yep, find that very helpful. Fantastic. And that's like taking I guess, almost like a step back out of like broadening to larger goals and then more specific goals. Absolutely. So why we're talking about this is because we need to look like sort of begin with an idea of like why we're focusing on self-regulated learning and metacognition today. That was kind of introducing the broader term here. But if we were to give like a larger overview, it helps us plan more effectively, which is coming across. We've got our student here talking about the 5-year plan with like sub goals and trying to get through a 2-year program with a 5-year plan. Helps us notice when we're stuck, as we talked about before. If we're feeling anxiety, if we're feeling maybe overwhelmed by it, we can step back away from it or work out how to work through it. When we look at like choosing better strategies, maybe like what works for us, we can reflect and improve and we can build lifelong learning habits. But it's starting with like understanding how we learn, and not just what we learn makes a big difference. So it's not just about saying we need you to learn these information and learn these theories that we're talking about today, but like It's understanding how we learn these. So it makes an enormous difference in terms of like how successful we are. So when we're planning more effectively, we're not wasting time or energy. Because when it comes to learning, learning is a very thinking and cognitive and brain heavy activity where we might sit there and if you sit down for if you look through the expectations of the units at SCU and you see how many hours you're expected to put into working on a unit each term. Do either of you happen to know what that information is off the top of your head? Like how many hours in like the study plans or guides or the unit guides? How many hours does it say? 20 per week. And if you have to get to 20 hours per week of study, that's very draining cognitively, draining demand on resources of your brain working. Our brain is always using energy, and the more we put it towards something, focus, attention, building those networks, as we've talked about in terms of like the last couple of weeks of those like semantic networks of our working memory to our long-term memory, that all takes energy. And it may not seem like it because we're sat at a desk or sat in a chair or sat somewhere with like a notebook or a computer or a textbook in front of us. But if we have to do 20 hours of that, it's very energy consuming, but also it's very time consuming. I imagine everyone here has jobs, families, hobbies, things that we'd want to do other than sit here with this learning activity. So we want to be efficient with it. So making sure that we're actually like using appropriate strategies to be efficient with it. Particularly because when it comes to like adult learning at a university, you are expected to be self-regulated. You get like this 2 hour tutorial time here now and a 1 hour workshop. Outside of that, it's not like Vicky as the UA or me as the tutor can sit down and work with you for the other 17 hours of the per week. You have to work out how to do it effectively. And part of that's going to be things like noticing when we're stuck. So instead of only realizing that we're stuck right before a deadline or not starting and not getting anywhere because we never initiate, we never get past that like roadblock, it's about us knowing what things make us stuck, what kind of like what is it that we need to be able to get going or push past something or move around it even, or even just when to ask for help. And then there's also choosing strategies intentionally. So I think a lot of us might default to reading and summarizing and making notes. Like making notes on a notebook or on a Word document feels like it's productive, but is it the most effective for us? Because some people kind of get stuck in this idea of just by reading, making notes, that's learning. And it is on some level, but is it the most effective strategy? Is it the one that we should use intentionally? And there's reflecting and improving in a way that makes us change our future behaviors. So how does this form lifelong habits? So just as an example, even though like I do quite a lot of work, like both in research as well as having been doing a PhD and putting together my whole thesis over the last few years, to sit down and do that work, to read articles, to learn information, to retrieve information from them, to write up, this many thousands of word document. Sometimes I still have to default back to like particular strategies to get me to work on it to learn. So one of them is just creating the environment, going very behaviorism and like creating the environment that I only sit down and with it, like I sit down with a cup of coffee, put my headphones onto a particular like you know, playlist of music to help me go, okay, now I'm focused and I'm only working. And if something distracts me from that, I have to stop and move away from that because it's sort of like training myself that I'm working in this particular environment with these cues. And that helps you build like a learning, like these habits of learning where in that moment, I'm ready to learn, I'm ready to take in that information again and ready to apply it. And it's about working out like what helps you like reflecting on things to work out what helps you. So for me, creating those like discrete zones of I'm here and I only work in these spaces helps make it a learning or a productive space as opposed to say sat on the couch in front of the TV, which I have also worked in and tried to study in front of. Not as good as a learning for learning habits. So it's not just skills for children. These are things that we work on as adults as well, for university, for study, for work, and for everyday life. So what I'm getting at is when we're looking at self-regulated learning, it's just being like self-regulating as an adult. How do we work? How do we learn? And I imagine that we each have some strategies around that that we all either subconsciously or consciously apply. So the tutorial today is going to be looking at these because they're like the invisible parts of learning, the stuff that like we might not always talk about, but is part of the whole experience. So are there parts of like when we look through this that are there like strategies or that we use intentionally? Are there ways that we effectively plan our time? Are there things that we've been reflecting on and improving even just across this unit or over the past year in terms of our own learning or our own work? So like I said, one of mine was creating like an environment for learning that is focused and is about productivity. And it's a strategy of getting myself in the space that when I sit down in it, I'm working and I'm on task. When I'm off task, I'm not in that space. So it kind of like primes myself or gets me into the space that when I'm there, I'm learning and I'm productive. That's just one of many parts of like the larger strategy sort of stuff. I'm just wondering if the people here today, if a couple of students here today have any similar things like that, like when we're talking about these parts of breaking down SRL, do we have something like this? Yeah, past painful experience of procrastination, taught you not to do that. Use a reward such as time on the telly or meeting friends to help. Absolutely. That's a great one. Rewarding ourselves, like very similar thing, goes into that kind of behaviorism and reward systems. Uh, Jitenda, if I'm pronouncing that right, do we have an example from you as well?
Yes,
Yes.
I also try that when I study. I try to study in a quiet environment like a library so that I can do more productivity.
Yep. Yep. A library, nice quiet space, and also kind of dedicated for learning. I like that. Telling other people about these theories helps understand where you don't or don't have. Absolutely. That's one of my favorite ones. I always would encourage every student as soon as you're learning something, like try to explain it to a friend, to a family member, to kids, to other people you know, talk about it wherever it applies. Tell your pets, try and teach your pets this as well. Like whoever will listen, if you can explain something and you can explain it, that's a great way of showing it, your understanding and helping you improve it. And you hello, ASL teachers who can have these conversations, discuss where lines of practice. You've already been using it in the classroom. Absolutely. That's a really good one as well, because a lot of this stuff you're probably already doing, already have some familiarity with. It's then about like labeling it and putting it into practice. So I think that's great. And part of that is like that reflection improvement. Some of it's part of it's also just like, I guess putting a name to it, that reflection is part of it, but also maybe seeing that some of these are lifelong habits. So, what is self-regulated learning? Basically, it's how we learn. It's learning how to learn. And a really simple, this is going to be like a really simple and practical look at it, just to kind of just to give you kind of like the expect like managing expectations of how we're talking about it here. So we talk about it as essentially learning how to learn is what we want to really dig into here. So it's not about the content itself, and it's more about the process. So it's the process you're using when you're learning something new or complex. So even as we talked about here with that example just then, the idea of you know, one of our students here being an ESL teacher who is probably doing a lot of these things that we've talked about across the unit, but putting it into words. So it's about like looking at that process of learning. So you're obviously already learning a lot of this information and learning how to apply it effectively. But we're now looking at the processes that you're using when learning this information. And one of them being like explaining it to other people and talking about it kind of as a group with like practicing ESL teachers is a really good like example of that. So we normally talk about it in kind of like three phases, right? So the first one is planning. And planning is thinking about like what you want to achieve and how you approach it. So this is like a really effective part of it in terms of like not just jumping into learning and going, oh, I'm gonna like, I'm gonna learn Spanish. So instead of just saying I'm gonna learn Spanish or another language or a whole complex area, you start thinking about like what you want to achieve and then how you'll approach it. So maybe why you want to learn a language like Spanish is that you're going to go on a holiday to a Spanish speaking country. So is what you want to do to become fluent in that language, or is it that you want to have conversational ability, like be able to talk broadly in that language, even if it's not always 100%? Or do you just need to know the very basics, like how to ask for directions, where the bathroom is, how to order food? Um, and when you can like get into like what that goal is, that'll help you then approach it. So in terms of this unit, what is it that we want to achieve from it, and then how are we approaching it is where we'd start with that planning. um so is your goal with this unit to pass? Is your goal with this unit to deeply engage with the content? Is your goal to meet every one of the unit learning outcomes? Like how you, I guess, put together what your goal is really will change like what your process is and how you're going about it. So the next part of that then becomes like the doing of it, the action, the like putting it into practice. So it's using strategies and it's monitoring, but it's actually like working on the task, applying strategies and applying what your plan, and then like monitoring how it's going. So you're doing two things, you're two or three things really. Well, first of all, you're actually learning, you're in the process, but you're also applying like particular strategies, and then you're also monitoring it and keeping track of it. You're in some form data collecting. So there's like an increasing move that like but to think about teachers as also like practitioners who are researching and applying. And why that's starting to happen is like getting teachers to understand research and how to apply theory, how to collect data, how to apply research, how to contribute to that, is because of this sort of part of that learning process, is that you need to be able to monitor it and understand how it's going, and then I guess track that and then be informed by that data, whether it's for you or other learners. And what then happens is reflecting on it, where you look back on what worked, what didn't, and how you might adjust it next time. So you need to know, be like really able to see what happened, what the aim was it achieved, and how you're kind of like tracking that to then make it, to evaluate it. So even when we don't realize that these things are happening in the background. So think about like how this applies to your learning processes, and just kind of think about like where you might see some of that. So do we kind of like plan out how we go about like our learning, or do we just do it? How do we keep track of it? How do we know it was effective? Are we reflective in our learning processes? And what does that look like for each of us? Because most learners don't really like think about this explicitly. We just jump into kind of the doing phase. We kind of skip over the planning or do the planning subconsciously potentially. So when we start to understand all the steps we're going to be using, learning becomes more intentional and easier to manage. So it's again breaking it down to like part of that's like, so goal setting research will be, if you've heard of SMART goals, that's why we have like a lot of research into goal setting at the moment, where you've got to break it down into like actionable and achievable goals. So for instance, because I do a lot of work in like psychology and health, more health sort of settings as well as education. If you're trying to change someone's behavior, like if you go to a doctor and they're saying, okay, well, it's time to lose some weight or time to be more active, you don't just go, okay, let's drop 20 kilos and get you running a marathon. You don't do that immediately. The way this kind of stuff happens is much more small, measurable, broken down into achievable steps. So okay, we're going to start by just walking. Go for a walk and just start with a walk. We'll build up to like 10,000 steps. Let's start by seeing if we can get to 1,000. Like, let's go for a walk, see what you can do. Just get a baseline of it. Then we'll start with, okay, let's get to 1,000 steps today. Okay, we've done, those two walks that got you to 1,000 steps. Now let's start adding to it and slowly increase over a period of time. So in learning, it's kind of similar. Like if you want to sit down and go, I'm going to do all 20 hours of study for this unit, can you go from doing no study to 20 hours, for instance? Or do you build up to it? Do you go, okay, let's start a plan. I can do this much study now, but I don't sit down for 5 hours straight. I need to do this and this and this. So it's just getting across that idea that like being intentional about it, breaking it down into what do you need to do? How are you going to go about doing it? And then applying that. So maybe your strategy is, the first day of the week, each week is go through the unit content. Then it's attend a tutorial. Then it's do some reading for the assessments, and then it's writing. Or maybe there's some combination of that that's much more focused into each day where you do a certain amount of time each day on those things. I guess I'm just trying to get across that these things can become quite conscious of, and when we make them more conscious, that's when we can start really getting the best out, most effective use of it. So we're going to look at like exploring how these phases show our learning. So you see 5 aspects of learning here: planning, staying focused, monitoring, reflecting, choosing strategies. And what I want you to do is to rank them from the easiest to the hardest for you personally. So don't overthink it. This is just for you personally. What do you feel is the hardest, and what do you feel is the easiest here? Yep, I can put the Menti thing in the chat. No problem. Just find the chat. There we go. And the code is up on the screen there as well. Only see me. That should be the code to put into it. There we go. So it's a working hour in there. Ah, that's all right. Worst case scenario, we just put them in the chat or talk them through as well. Oh, there we go. Both are, yeah, looks like something's working. And so 2 people. So as we go through this again, there's no right or wrong answers. It's just, some of us might find planning harder, some of us might find reflecting or reflection harder or easier. So we might be great at getting started, but struggling with monitoring or vice versa. So it's just kind of to see where we're all at. So like I've had some responses. So looks like kind of across it, planning is the one that seems easiest, where staying focused sounds like it's the hardest across our small sample here. And I think it's always interesting to see how people experience learning here. So, like, some feel completely natural, others feel like a challenge, and that's across like all ages, adults, uni students, school students, everyone. It's different. But I think it's interesting that like planning seems to be the one we're most comfortable with, and that kind of, I think, tracks because way back at the start of the tutorial, we had both our students here today, talking about like the first step is just getting an overview or breaking it down into goals. Um, And it's interesting that staying focused seems to be the one that's like slightly feels slightly harder for us. And I can completely understand that. So, but I'd always be curious, like, where does the staying focused difficulty come from? Is it that there's too many things to do? Is it like the content, too much content, not interesting content, not engaging? Yep, sometimes our minds just wander. But you see why this is important. So if you, even from our own personal learning sort of experience and trying to keep track of our own personal learning where we have this information because it's our own feelings and thoughts and behaviors, it can be tricky to work out like what does staying focused look like when we're saying we're struggling with that as adults who are here to engage with engaging content to be doing the thing that we want to do. So if we were then to think about applying this like as teachers with other learners, what does that look like in terms of if we can already acknowledge staying focused is hard for us, what do we do with that information for others? And it can maybe help us sit there and go, it's not about the plan, it's not about the strategies or even monitoring sometimes. Maybe it's just focus is becoming the issue. So how do we go about that? Yep. Providing variety and mini breaks absolutely works for at least one of our students here. Can completely relate to that. Bit of competition. Yep. Time limit even. Yep. That's why you've also got things like the Pomodoro, I think it's because the Pomodoro technique where like 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off sort of thing, or whatever the exact time for that's meant to be, where it breaks it up into you are completely focused for a small block and then you have a break from it. Mind wanders lets you like do all that mind wandering, check your phone, have some water, get up, move about, whatever works for you. But like it gets back into that thing of like staying focused, where maybe it's easier to train your brain or body to be focused for even 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes at a time as small discrete doses, and then being able to like walk away from it to not feel like you have to focus for several hours straight. And I guess like the thing is looking at our ranking results here that we'll notice is that there's variation. People learn differently. Some are great at reflecting, but hard to stay focused. Some find the whole cycle challenging, and that's all completely normal. That's going to be the same for every student you encounter. So if it's the same for us and the same for people we can talk about with as adults, we're going to see that that's going to be very much the same when working with learners as teachers. So the important thing here is self-regulated learning is a learned skill. It's not something that you're born knowing how to do. Some people might find it easier to pick up or apply or to latch onto than others, but it's still a skill that we're all working towards and learning as we go. So we can find different phases challenging for different reasons. And as we talked about just then, like competition, time limits, time pressure, can be things that can be beneficial for people. They could also be detrimental. Confidence is another one as well. Not knowing where to begin, or even just like habits from previous learning environments. If we don't have good habits and good previous learning environments, it makes it then harder to learn these skills and go from there. So once we start to understand our patterns, what comes naturally, what doesn't, learning becomes manageable. It's like turning light, like as a metaphor, it's like turning lights on in the room that you've been moving through in the dark. If you tried moving through the dark or like close your eyes and walk through an environment, even a familiar one, you can get quite lost. So having that extra insight is like turning on a light switch and going, oh, I can now navigate this floor more easily. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at, that it's a learned skill. Different phases challenge people differently, and some things are easier when we know our patterns. And it's taking that, like internalizing that with us first. And if we kind of think and approach learning from this kind of perspective ourselves, how much easier is it going to be to work with other people who are trying to navigate the same process? So in terms of like self-regulated learning, how do we see being able to apply that with like students and learners that we work with? What might that look like? How does that sort of sit with us? Yeah, model it, provide explicit information about it. Absolutely. I think even just verbalizing this as we're doing here could be a really good starting point because if we sit there and say, oh, like we just got to learn how to do something versus sort of sitting down with learners that we're working with and saying, this is the process and explaining it so that we might see if something resonates with them. Yeah, put it into assessments and tasks. Absolutely. Posters around the room. Yep. I do wonder sometimes about like having a don't know how to put it, but maybe like a little learning handbook or little book about how learning how to learn for learners in schools that goes with them from through certain age groups where when we ask them to do things like we kind of go like we kind of check in with them that like they know under like they can see um that they are doing these processes like when they're sitting there going, oh, how do I go about it, just giving them like a bit of a checklist of like, okay, so if I what are my goals? What are my processes? Have I done this? Have I done that part um, and check in that they're applying these or even comparing them across the year. Maybe that's part of the learning process. Yep, have it as one of the lessons at the start where the groups they learn about different strategies and they have to share the strategy with other groups. Absolutely. Maybe it's about putting together a whole bunch of different learning strategies and resources and getting them to apply each one of them across a certain time period, maybe across the term, and getting them to practice different types and see what works for them. Um, yeah, absolutely. Um, so the next bit we're talking about is metacognition. And metacognition is one of those like slightly I don't know. It's one of those slightly, I want to say, in vogue sort of terms in things like when we talk about cognition, which is our thinking, our thoughts, etc., and meta being very like about the thing. So like something being meta is kind of, you know, like a film that's being meta is a film that's about films or starts talking about process and things about films within a film. So it's essentially metacognition, thinking about thinking. And this is the concept that basically like drives self-regulated learning. This is what's happening like as the kind of pivotal part or like the pivotal or functional piece of what self-regulated learning is. And like I said, all you have to really understand about this concept is that it means thinking about thinking. So it's the awareness you bring to your learning process. It involves like three core things that we've got on the slide here. Noticing when you understand, noticing when you don't, and knowing what to do next. So noticing when something makes sense, noticing when something doesn't make sense, and knowing what to do next. So specifically, what strategy are you going to use, or how do you adjust your approach? So without this kind of like metacognition process or understanding of it, it kind of feels a bit like guesswork. And on some level, it will be trial and error, but without understanding what's going on in self-regulated learning, it just is completely trial and error. And we're just going to go, well, I'll try this because why not? As opposed to, well, I know that I do well at this type of learning, and I was trying to do this type of learning, which I don't do well at, so I should switch back to this strategy. Um, so it's helping us understand confusion early on and then make decisions quite intentionally. So this helps us stay in control of the learning that's going on. So importantly, it's a skill that can be developed, not something that you have or don't have. So as we were talking about a moment ago, the idea of even just having self-reflection activities or creating exercises or teaching students how to learn as part of like like early on in the school year, so that they then apply a bunch of different strategies. What that would involve is them noticing when they understand things, noticing when they don't, and then like what strategies are working. So it's helping like stay in control of that instead of just being like, okay, this is the one type of learning that everyone should try. Being able to kind of go, what is and isn't working? How do we think about it? How do we um intentionally make those decisions to escape a bit of like a loop of not understanding, getting frustrated, not understanding, and just applying the same thing over and over again. because it's that idea of if you keep doing the same thing over and over again but expecting different results, that's the definition of insanity. It is crazy talk to just do the one thing over and over and over and over again. So instead, we should be trying new things. So if we've got a classroom full of students who are all just looking baffled, or if there's one of them in particular that's not quite getting it, and what we've been doing is the same type of teaching over and over again. So for instance, if we just sat there and kept writing things on the board every lesson for 10 weeks, and there's one student not getting it, is that their fault that they're not getting it? Or is it more that we've just engaged them one way and it's not working for them? These are the kind of things to think about, both for like our own learning processes. Because if like the way we're studying isn't getting us the results we want, well, maybe we need to change it. We need to be thinking about what's happening and intentionally move to something different. If we're seeing someone that we're trying to teach have a similar process of not getting it and not really being able to engage with it or focus or learn or get the kind of learning that they're looking for, maybe we need a different approach. We need to sit there working out like what's going to break that sort of like loop. So we're gonna have a quick sort of check our understanding of metacognition with this Menti here. And we're gonna look at like the one that represents metacognition, where metacognition is thinking about thinking. So recognizing what's happening in your mind as you learn. But yep, I like the what we got in the chat there. Find it really hard selecting the correct strategy. And that's what's hard about this. Like when we break it down like this from a theoretical perspective, it makes a lot of sense. So easy, just like try something different, switch to something else and see what happens. But what's the correct strategy? How do we do that? That's the part that becomes a bit trickier and takes a bit of time because it's well and good for me to sit here and say, oh, try something different. But what? How do we pick the correct one? I think a lot of it comes from reflection and understanding the needs of the person. And it's a very like humanist psychology perspective of look at each person individually as people who are have their own agency and capacity for change. And I think that when you get very individual focused, you can figure that out collaboratively. But that becomes time consuming and it's not something that realistically the world allows time for. But that kind of focus and ability to sit with someone and like treat them, I think like exploring it curiously with them, exploring what works for them, what doesn't. How do you find the way to help them? Or how, more importantly, how do you find the way for them to kind of help themselves find that strategy or latch onto the thing that's going to work for them? Is kind of where the best case where learning happens, I think. But also, like I said, probably not what we have a ton of time for. Yep, and how to teach that for that student so they can learn to select the correct one. Absolutely. Because on some level, we're setting them up to be the ones doing the learning while we're there supporting it. So which of these is an example of metacognition? Is it underlining important ideas? Is it realizing that we don't understand a part of the work? Is it doing worked examples? Is it making summaries? Got one answer so far. Yes. So those here and those playing along at home, yeah, the correct answer is B. That's sort of like realizing that you don't understand part of it. That moment of awareness is like the core of metacognition. It's a trigger that tells us um, that I need to slow down, or I need a different strategy, or I need to check in whether this is making sense, or this isn't working for me, or even this is working for me if you are on the right track. So the other options are like common learning behaviors, but they're not metacognitive. They are like doing things. They are strategies in what you're doing. So metacognition is specifically about monitoring your own understanding and not just doing that task. And that's the thing that we need as learners and teachers ourselves, but also something that we're hopefully going to be like instilling in any learner that we work with. So we've kind of got a bit of a like cycle of it here to put it in a bit of a diagram. This and in terms of SRL, self-reflective sort of cycle that we've got going on here. We've got evaluative performance and adapt, so like reflection, analyzing the task. We've got planning, set our goals and lay out our strategies, and acting, applying strategies and monitoring performance. And they all kind of work in this cycle of one to the next over and over and over again. But you might jump around a little bit as well. But ideally, you'd probably start with the planning phase. That being said, you might kind of get you also might just kind of get stuck in with like, here's how you have to act. So if you're in a classroom environment on some level, you might just have the teacher telling you this is what we're doing today. You can still plan and set your goals and lay out your strategies, but on some level, you might get put into we're doing this today. In which case you then reflect and then plan in the future, et cetera, et cetera. So it is quite continuous, and we've explored metacognition, I guess. It shows like it's now sort of showing us like that it is in the learning process in general. And we're going to place it kind of in that sort of self-regulated learning cycle broadly in terms of like the first part being forethought or planning. So when we talk about it as planning, we're talking about like forethought. And that's what I meant by sometimes you might kind of get thrown into it because like in a classroom, you might not have the same forethought or time for forethought if you're the student. That being said, you can still kind of sit down and plan, but it's about setting goals, analyzing what the task requires, thinking about the steps that you'll need, and then choosing the strategies before you begin. So it's forethought because it's happening before. So all those processes should become more and more explicit and more intentional. So as you'll notice, we keep talking about like what the outcomes each week are, what the plan, like the learning outcomes and kind of setting up the goals at the start of each tutorial each week. That's kind of giving you that forethought. It's what are we looking for you to get out of this? What and setting up the goals. This then helps like analyze kind of like as we're starting, how you're going to approach it, how you're going to get to that point. Even though we're guiding you through the tutorial, there's some amount of how you are going to engage with it. Even if it's as simple as I'm going to sit here during the tutorial and not have a second screen open, or I'm going to mute my phone, or I'm going to make sure that there's no one distracting me around me. And then we've got like performance or action. This is like the doing phase. You're active, you're working on the task, and importantly, performance isn't just doing, it's also monitoring. So it's doing in terms of applying strategies, but it's also doing in terms of monitoring, noticing, checking in. What are you doing? Is it actually working? What's your understanding? Adjust as needed. So make sure that we know whether it's working and that we're intentional with what we're doing, and kind of like data collecting on ourselves, checking that we are actually measurably doing the thing. And then we get the reflection, which gets called evaluation as well. And this is a phase where you look back on how it went, what worked well, what didn't, what might you do differently next time. And I think that's a really important way of phrasing it. I don't think that we should break it down into good, bad, better, worse. We can highlight strengths, which we absolutely should. We can reflect and go, what was our strength? What did we do well? What worked? So if being in a quiet environment helped, good tick. Strength is environment quiet, that worked well. What was our strength? We followed through the plan and did 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And there's the other way to think about the other parts is not what went badly or what didn't we do, but what could we do differently next time? And it's that language of like instead of better or worse, something was done badly, not done well. It's what could we do differently? That's all we're doing. We're exploring it and we're evaluating and reflecting on what could we try? What could be done differently? And it kind of might help frame it as instead of like, oh, I did this again, it doesn't work, it's really bad. I'm terrible because I keep doing this, or I'm really bad at this, and moving it more towards, okay, this thing, I think that if I tried to instead of teach other people what I'm doing because I then just start talking to them, maybe what I need to do is develop like test questions myself and test myself. and moves it away from this was a bad strategy to maybe I'll try it differently this way. And reflection on strength as well is also an important part of it because it helps update your approach. Like what was good, highlighting the stuff that worked, not just what didn't work. Because if you just look at what didn't work, you're potentially throwing out the good that did work as part of it. So every new learning situation pulls you into planning, then doing, then reflecting, is basically what we're saying with this. Okay, now that we've looked at the structure of the SRL cycle, let's think honestly about our own learning patterns. Which one of these do we most often skip? Planning, monitoring, or reflecting? And it's not about judgment. It's about being aware of where our own learning habits are strongest, maybe where there's areas that we do differently or grow. What do we skip as learners? And frankly, quite often, like I think that as much as I do maybe the planning stage, I quite often might skip like having explicit goals, like setting down what's my goal from this. I'll break it down into like manageable, actionable items and I'll plan out the content and way I'll go about things, but not necessarily what my end goal is always. So that's one that if I were to look back and reflect on it, that might be where I sit with and go, I could maybe include that a bit more or have a bit of room to grow in. Got monitoring is one of them. Yeah. And I think like that's a common one. Monitoring is one that a lot of us can skip. Yeah, maybe that's true for you too. That put it that way. Um, no, that's fair. And I think like if we break it down, odds are there's probably a few places we could be more attentive to. Yep, we think that we do some monitoring, see what's working and not working, and change it. Yep. But maybe if we've been better planned, potentially. And it's completely normal to like skip over or spend less time on monitoring, partly because like we're busy, we're stressed, we're uncertain. The only part that feels urgent is doing the task. So monitoring that we're doing it doesn't feel urgent as opposed to just doing it. You know, we've got a 2,000 word essay due, we've got to get 2,000 words down, we've got to get the essay done. Are we monitoring how we went about doing it? We've got 10 chapters of a textbook to read across 10 weeks. Do we care about monitoring how we've gone about our strategy of learning that information, or do we just care that we got through it? Um, so yeah, we've got some chat going already. Definitely self-reflect, but don't always know a good way to improve or change the approach or strategy. That's good insight. But should you know how to do that? Should learning strategies and ways to improve it only come from us? Because I imagine that when we reflect, we sit there going, oh, what could I do differently? And ask ourselves and check in. Do we take it elsewhere? Do we do research into what's effective? Do we ask knowledgeable others? Do we talk to other peers? Do we find other ways of going about it and research them? Yep, have done that. How do I teach this tricky grammar point? Absolutely. And I think that that's an interesting one, though. How do I do this thing in terms of how do I teach this? We're very good at like reflection on work, on actionable things, on our things that we're being judged for as a work outcome, and for teaching others. It's easy to kind of get that feedback and reflection on how do I do this process so that I can do it. We feel maybe more comfortable with that. But when it's about how do I personally better learn information? How do I try a different learning strategy, this internal process that's happening? I think maybe people are less comfortable with that or think about it less. But it could be, it could be a really good way of doing it. That's one of my favorite things to do when teaching is to ask, how do others learn? What strategies do people use? Because you sometimes get some really, really interesting ways of going about learning that can be really like really effective to adopt. Or maybe we put into words what we do that actually helps us. Um, Yeah, then a wider range of strategies, absolutely. So there could be things about like why we think that we skip like monitoring or other phases of this process. And it might be time pressure, it might be not knowing how to plan, it might be never having been taught what monitoring or reflection actually looks like. It might just be these are all new concepts even. So what we're seeing here like aligns with research into SRL in terms of higher education studies. And it shows that university students in particular spend most of their time in like the performance phase, getting through the task. And so we don't have research on this. I'm like, this is just my hypothesis, my speculation on it, is that since SCU has moved to a 6 week model where there is 6 weeks to get through the whole unit, and there's essentially assessments at the end of week 3 or 4, and then one at the end of week 6, if not more involved. I suspect that there's a very much a focus on this is the measurable outcome. This is the thing that where my attention needs to go because of the urgency. I'm therefore going to do. Um, it kind of goes action, 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 need to keep doing, doing, doing. So like there's little time to plan, or when we do plan, it very quickly goes out the window because we got sick for that week, because we've got our kids home from school for the week during school holidays, because we've got like work suddenly got swamped, we got called in for a few extra shifts. Um, something happens that the plan goes out the window. We don't make a new plan. It's just action, action, action. And I suspect that there's probably something about that. But yeah, as someone he's saying, makes this plan out the steps more specifically. Absolutely. It does reduce the timeline and makes it much more actionable. Um, but interestingly, as part of the research in general into like higher education students, is that students who consistently use all three phases, so planning, monitoring, and reflection, achieve higher grades and show like stronger transfer of knowledge. So it's not just about working harder that matters. It's working in a way that is regulated, aware, and strategic. So I guess my like what I'm putting out there to all of you, a challenge to all of you is, are we doing all of these? Are we actually like um consistently using all three phases? And are we feeling like we're working in a much more like, for lack of a better word, smarter, not harder kind of way? How much do we do this and how much are we actually focusing on each of these steps? And even as I talk about it in classes, quite often I like try to help, I guess, run it as part of tutorials. Sometimes I sit there going, man, do I do all three of those things as consistently as I should? I would say that I probably do a lot of them quite consistently, but do I always do them? Am I doing these as effectively as I could? Because like I work in research, like I teach, but I also like have just essentially submitted a thesis for a PhD, which is like learning and becoming an expert in a whole topic. And as I do research, I'm constantly learning about new areas. Do I do all of this sort of stuff to make sure that I'm continuously learning effectively as part of my work? It's goal to be aware of, keep it in mind rather than have always achieved it, can always improve. Yeah, that could absolutely be a way of thinking about it. So it's about like, I think it's just kind of internalizing this as approach is probably where I'd put it at. And my challenge to everyone like here today and listening to it later is, do we think that we can kind of internalize this? Do we think that this becomes part of how we learn going forward, or more intentional version of this if we're already doing it? So, when we're like modeling metacognition, this is sort of like partly put together by Vicky in terms of like an approach to learning something new, which does kind of like broadly align with like how I learn as well. So we're kind of going to go through about like what thinking aloud is. So it's a simple learning, like in a simple learning situation, having to learn a new theory that you've never seen before, learning new information and research that you've not really seen before. And we can kind of talk through a process. Is the screen not sharing? Has that been the whole time, just not sharing? That's interesting. I swear that was set up. Let me just see. I have been like I've been pointing at the screen and using my mouse to put. I hope that's been recording. If not, that is wild. Okay, looks like the no, that's all right. That's on me. Yeah, it's now sharing. I think that I had it selected as sharing and I must have accidentally stopped it at some point. Ah, that's gonna explaining so much. Okay, so I think I know what happened because I was on the wrong slide when I first shared it earlier. I think I must have accidentally unshared it when I did that. Apologies to everyone watching this and just seeing me instead of the actual slides. I imagine a bunch of like fun looking slides like this that's been going throughout the whole tutorial, just to give you a taste of what they look like. But yes, now visual cues enabled. Hopefully this will make things a lot clearer. Apologies for that. I don't actually know what happened. Okay. Yeah, good for self-reflection. Absolutely. So now this will hopefully make more sense as I'm pointing out things. So how we approach something new. One way of doing it is kind of like thinking about, I think we're gonna have like a simple learning situation and we can kind of talk through what happens. So in terms of like a starting point, a good way of going at it is like not being focused on um, getting a theory right, getting the information right, but focusing on what happens in your mind as you're learning. So as you listen to what we go through, like pay attention to like where I might pause, adjust what I'm doing, make decisions about moving forward. And like we're gonna kind of talk about this in the Menti section a bit uh in a second. So what I thought I might do is let me just find one. Um so we'll get which one will I grab? Okay, I'll grab this one for instance. So, like, instead of it being a theory, it's specifically, I'll just kind of talk you through something I've been doing and learning about recently. And let's see if I can get it to move across. So, good thing we checked um, that it was all working before. So you should see a journal article pop up here in front of you now. Good. So recently, as part of like a research project I've been involved with, like looking at we're looking at AI and in particular how you might use AI in a classroom. So like artificial intelligence. My areas are broadly like psychology, cognitive psychology, emotions, a whole bunch of different stuff as well as education more recently. But artificial intelligence, not something I have a deep knowledge of, and we're looking at essentially putting together like what are some of the challenges of using AI in a classroom and in particular so like younger years as well. So one of the things I'm doing is going through like a lot of the literature, looking through literature to I guess start learning about what's out there, trying to understand the area, understanding the theories, understanding the content. So in this case, here's a journal article, one of the ones of quite a few that I've identified as maybe being useful to what we're doing. And where I'm going to start is I typically start by skimming first. So I skim information quite a lot to kind of get the broad, is this like what am I getting my head around? If I went right back to the start of my process, it would start by Googling. It would start just by like quick searches. It's starting to get like doing maybe a bit of a Google about like what's out there. Start with like when I start getting into the actual research papers and go to a database. Ideally, I'd want to find like a paper that overviews. So like a textbook or something that gives you the bigger picture. But I'll often pick like articles and start with a skim read. So like you skim through what's in the title, get an understanding of it. I skim through the abstract. So I'll be sitting there going, you know, AI, machine learning, neural networks. I'm seeing things like that and going, okay, these are terms that I probably want to make sure that eventually I'm on top of. So first of all, I feel like I know what artificial intelligence is, but what's applied AI? What's machine learning? That sort of stuff. What are neural networks in this case? So in this case, it's about like maybe I'm familiar with the terms, but do I know them in this context? So when we start skim through just to kind of get a broad idea of what's going on, for me, I'm seeing things like online learning environments. So Khan Academy, I vaguely remember what that is from having come across it, but it's getting across this idea that there are like online learning environments and programs and companies that AI is going to be getting applied to. Um, we're seeing that there's like flawed data, yada yada yada. There's controversy. And this is kind of giving me an idea of what this whole thing is going to be about. So what I then do is I continue to skim. I start with like it's particularly effective for journal articles where skimming, getting my head around it. What's the big picture? So I start with like the very two paragraphs, set the scene, give me context. Um, so basically, there's a collaboration between it, but basically the study looked at deep learning approach to educational data sets, training data sets using information to get like deep knowledge tracing. This just gives me an idea of what the whole thing is. Quite often, I'll then skim further down and just see what are the titles. STS and artificial intelligence, don't know what STS is. I'm going to have to come back to that. I'm going to mentally note that down as what else do I need there? So, as I'm just doing this right now, I should be keeping note of things like what definitions do I need? So STS, whatever STS is, I need to make sure I know what applied AI is. I might even want to make sure that I have a definition of artificial intelligence that's like research based and not just my own one. And before I get kind of locked into any details, I'm kind of sitting there going like, what do I want out of the first read? Because I'm not expecting understanding, but I just kind of want the basics. So what I want out of the basics is kind of skimming back down to see like hence our focus is analysis of a whole bunch of range of categories, hidden digital mechanism. Um, typically they end down here. Yeah, there we go. The key argument that we develop is the attempt to predict and automate aspects of education performance through AI technology. Uh, yeah, this kind of gives me an idea of what they're looking at. The more things are simplified, the more complexity they require to remain real. Yep. This, I would say, is not particularly well written, but it gives me, because it's not as clear as it could be, but it gives me an idea of like what the purpose that they're doing here is to kind of know what do I need to know about this. If it's a research, I often have a look at the methodology to see what they're doing. And in this case, they take 8 articles that comprise DKT. What was DKT? I feel like I read that before. So again, getting that idea of like, let's get some, yeah, deep knowledge tracing. Let's get some definitions. So basically, they doing machine learning, which is a whole complex statistical procedure that I'm vaguely familiar with across a bunch of papers. So that helps me know that this one in particular is going to create some sort of model from previous research and data sets as opposed to collecting data themselves by the looks of it. And there's a whole bunch of models of that. Then I would skim down and go, where's the conclusion? This article brings a number of different perspectives, relations and tensions between versions of learning. Talks about that. And when you get right down to what's the final thing that it says, okay, so basically, like it's using a type of machine learning approach to look at AI and particular AI programs. That's kind of the broad big picture that I managed to get out of this. And this gives me a basic sense of it. Like I said, I showed multiple instances of like where I wasn't following. So like I skimmed through this, wasn't fully following, went further down, did not know what this term is about. And down here, first of all, this stuff might make more sense if I've read the whole thing. but as a just general skim through it, doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not really sure what it means. So what I started doing as I was talking through with all of you was taking bits and pieces and putting it into my own words. And it starts giving me an insight to some of it makes sense, but not always. So how could I then go back through this? Obviously, more time. So I'm not just like skimming through it as an overview here. But how would I go about this with a different approach? Maybe I look for like diagrams of some of the methodology to see it in action. They had some of those. Maybe I need like a core idea to anchor my understanding of this information. So I could basically like go through this section by section, so up to from the first bit up to this endpoint, and kind of sit there and go, what did I understand? What's unclear? That will tell me kind of like what to do next. Because maybe I just need to reread it. Maybe I need to read it several times. Maybe what I need to do is read the whole thing and get like, so I have all the information in context and then go back and focus in on rereading sections at a time. Maybe I need like simpler explanations. Maybe what I need to do is I need to go find a better explanation of it. Maybe I need to check another source. And maybe what I need to do is go down here to the reference list and find, what I actually need is, um, an overview of machine learning. Maybe what I need to do is better understand that process. So I know this is a really like slightly rushed example of going through like a journal article as opposed to like a theory, but this is kind of what I do each day when working, to be honest. Like looking at information and kind of learning about a new topic or learning more about a topic that I already know about. Um, I could do it with more specific examples, like all my areas looking at my specific areas looking at color emotion associations. So like why red is anger, blue sadness, yellow joy kind of thing from a cognition and cognitive standpoint. And in that case, there's constantly that thing of like, so like how I had to learn about that was going through and going, okay, so what is the color? Starting with definitions of color, moving towards emotions. What are emotions? How are they connected? And building knowledge by that and checking in constantly with, okay, what did I understand? What's not clear? So it sounds maybe a bit chaotic when I was saying it all out loud because this is something that we kind of do silently. It's very internal and different for each of us. So when we make it visible, maybe it becomes easy to understand how that learning approach works. So looks like we lost one of our students there, but we still got at least one. Was that helpful in any way? What did we notice about what I'm doing as I go through it? Again, in a little bit of a rushed, slightly quick example. Yeah, absolutely. Makes you think about the way you do it. Glad that happens at least. And like I said, I feel like that's maybe a slightly more chaotic example of it, but it's just trying to get across like I thought it might be useful to go through it because like from a research standpoint, I would argue that all research is just learning new information and learning and learning and learning. So now that you've kind of listened to that, can you identify some like metacognitive moments that you might have heard in that? Like where did I use metacognition in the example? And we don't have to like use the correct terminology, but did we notice anything that like what did you notice about what I was doing there, I guess, that might fall under metacognition? Yeah, talked about what I was doing, thought about what I understood. Absolutely. Thought about about how I could figure out what I didn't understand. Yeah. Yeah. And there could be some like if I was doing that more real time, I guess, and reading through it properly, I might slow down or I might paraphrase more. I might plan out the next steps specifically. Basically, they're like metacognitive moves that often happen invisibly when people learn. So the other side of it is like This is, yep, discuss different strategies, absolutely. And this is hopefully like as an example, like modeling that shows why it can be like effective or powerful or useful. Because when you hear someone think out loud, you kind of notice like mental decisions that are going on that are sport learning. And I mean mental as in internal, not like crazy, but like those internal mental cognitive thought process kind of decisions that are supporting learning. And in my case, you might notice that that the way I work is that ju I jump around all the place with a whole bunch of different things. But that's also kind of situating where information you have sort of does sit with us because like machine learning sort of stuff, I'm fairly familiar with that from like as an approach that I've engaged with in other areas of research, but not so much in AI specific research. That some of the stuff about AI, I've read other articles that give me more of a what people's, in particular, educators' thoughts on AI is. Um, but I'm not so familiar with the types of particular sites that they're using there. Yep, notice areas of challenge, terms I hadn't heard of before, absolutely. Like I even highlighted that what's applied AI versus AI is just as a starting point. So moving to the next bit, like why modeling matters is that learners don't see the thinking work. So like unless it's shown, teachers often do metacognition for students. So making that like invisible skill visible builds like lifelong learning skills. So one of the biggest challenges for learners is that the is like that thinking work, the planning, the checking, the adjusting. It's not visible. It's not something that it's not something that you always put on a piece of paper and the teacher goes, yes, that's it. We're kind of doing it and we might be doing it differently or in ways that are could be clearer or could be supported more. So students see the final sentence, like the finished paragraph, the completed example when we give those as examples, but they don't see the tiny decisions and moments of uncertainty that led there. So that journal article I was reading and any journal article I've written, when you see the final version of it, you're seeing like when your thoughts have been the most edited and finished and polished. You're not seeing all the choices that go into that, all the decisions that go into that. Even down to like the decisions about which article I selected just then to give as an example. So like one of the decisions about why I picked that one to go through was A, I hadn't read it yet. So I was doing it live. B, it's like a practical decision because this doubles up on some work later. I've now started to get an idea of what that article's about. So I've like minimized my workflow, I guess, but also that it's like a novel and slightly interesting topic that I thought might be fun to go through as well. That like looking at AI as something that's quite, particularly in education, is becoming quite a hot button area as well. So there's a lot of little thoughts that went on for me to make come to that decision, but maybe not ones that we think about. Yep. So have student definitely you have students that support metacognition without telling them why they're doing it explicitly. So like pre-reading questions, support for skimming, but we may not tell them that. Yep. And I think that's a good example of it. Another part of it is because that people don't see this, many assume that good learners just get it straight away. We're not party to the process going on in our own head, so we might be seeing other people get this information that we don't. Um, So we feel like, oh, other people just get this straight away, or I shouldn't be, um, I shouldn't be confused, or sometimes they hit a barrier. Something must be wrong with them, or something must be wrong with us because we're not seeing that process for everybody, and we're not seeing what could be helpful or what the processes are. As our example just then, like you said, they don't realize this could be something that's helpful for them. So in reality, confusion, slowing down, paraphrasing, adjusting strategy is what learning looks like. Just how quickly, effectively, strategically, efficiently we are able to do it changes with practice and deliberation and intentionality. So modeling can be a powerful teaching tool to show our thoughts. And to be honest, I always think that like teachers should be that transparent. I like, even just down to I've been teaching this whole tutorial without my slide being on the screen. I'd say I'd like to think that I'm tech savvy enough to have noticed that, but I clearly didn't. And I could sit there being like trying to bluff something about like, oh, that was intentional to see he was paying attention, or like, mistakes happen. We explain things differently. We're learning as we go. I guess owning and modeling like what it looks like to learn. Even just like a small learning experience like that of double checking that my screen was actually sharing, and kind of like when I make my motions with my mouse over here, knowing that people are seeing that would help. Um, and I think that like being transparent about our own learning processes and modeling those is the best way to show other people how to learn as well. Yep, I'll probably be doing that going forward. Absolutely. Honestly, like to be honest, the thing about that is that I've been doing this so long that I genuinely just forgot to do that this time. I've done that this what like I could do that 100 more times, and each time at the start of a tutorial, I typically go, "Can we see the screen in front of me now before we begin?" I didn't do it this time. Um, I think it's just even down to like checking in with what we do. Like if I'm reflecting on it, to be honest, I don't really know why I didn't do it this time. I just started talking and went, "Oh yeah, it's fine. I know this is fine." Um, I did all the checking internally on my end, essentially. So when we model things, we make things that are invisible visible. It gives us like access to the metacognitive process that expert learners are using. And that's what teachers, researchers, educators kind of are, expert learners, or at least in theory, expert learners. And not expert as in we have all the answers and are the best at it now, but in terms of like engaging with it, practicing it, using it all the time. So over time, learners will observe these processes and start using them themselves. So like I do like to be quite yeah, like explain what I'm doing as I'm doing a learning process to go, here's a little trick about how I do something, or here's why I do something, because it helps other people kind of see what that process looks like. It also opens you up to seeing a better process be given back to you. If someone says, well, if you're doing this, like this is another way of doing that, or I've tried this because this was effective for me. So it gives the foundation of learning being like lifelong, being able to notice what's happening in our thinking and choose what to do next. Let's bring this all back to our own learning now that we've kind of looked at metacognition and SRL. So, going to shift away from like watching my thinking and looking more at your one. And what's a subject, and think about like one subject or topic that you've studied maybe this term that you find challenging. So it might be something you're avoiding, something unfamiliar, something with a lot of detail, something where the instructions don't feel clear. So what is the topic and why do you find it challenging? Does not need to be a long answer, just a sentence is enough. But what is a topic and why are we finding it challenging? Yep, all the theories are challenging because of no previous exposure. Absolutely. So again, if there are more students live here, and I encourage anyone watching this later just to kind of think about this for yourself. What's the topic and why do you find it challenging? Um, and I think that like it can be content for some people, it can be motivation, it can be organization, it can be uncertainty about where to begin. The reasons are really important because, like, at this stage, identifying the challenge and why it feels difficult sits right in that forethought process of self-regulated learning. It's the awareness that helps you decide what to do next. And because, like, my main area was psychology, for instance, like, in contrast to our student here, like, the theories in this class are probably stuff that I know quite intuitively. Some of the like education vocabulary and like specific classroom environment sort of stuff is stuff that I picked up in that transition into education. Some of the specifics to education that you internalize across the degree versus like my background being in psychology are things that I had to like work out how to pick up, like the particular type of acronyms and language that gets used, where sometimes I'll sit there going, I think I know what that is, but the acronym throws me. Or even just down to like we talk about each of these theories and we focus a lot on like self-efficacy and Bandura's sort of theories and Piaget and all these parts of development. one of the things I like, I think they're great, but I also care quite deeply about like humanism in psychology, that sort of very like person-centered approach. Um, which I think is one of the most important ways to engage with people. But when teaching and you have groups of students, how easy is it to be person-centered and focus on specific people when you've got 30 people that you've got to look after in that time period? So I think there's like what the challenge is and how we address that can be really and like what we're challenging and why is what we're trying to get at there. So if we then start like mapping that, what strategies could help with that challenge? Now that we've named the challenge, reflected on why it's difficult, the next step would be choosing the strategy. So select as many examples that apply to your situation. So if the content feels overwhelming, break it into smaller steps. The ideas are confusing, summarizing. If you're forgetting things, space, practice, or retrieval. If instructions weren't clear, clarification. So let's have a look at what we get going from that. And if we look at the distribution here, you'll notice that different strategies help with different types of challenges. So again, if you're watching later, think about which of these would help you. We've got our example of a student here. But in terms of this case of like engaging with the theories, like summarizing as you go is a way to go about it to help summarize each bit of information, practicing retrieval questions, spacing it out so that you're engaging with these theories and how they apply multiple times and building those networks, connecting new ideas to prior knowledge in terms of um, maybe you are teaching and these are like you have knowledge about what to do in these situations. Now you're just connecting the theory and the theory behind it to what you're already doing. And maybe it's using examples that'll help. So this reinforces something different. There's no single strategy that works for everything. There's no one size fits all approach. There's no, this is the one thing to do that will solve everything. There's going to be multiple strategies you could try. Um, you're building like an effect, like a flexible toolkit to be effective across how you learn, and you're using them intentionally is what we're looking for here. So when you map out like your strategy with the SRL cycle, every strategy you select fits into at least one of these three phases. There are planning strategies, so like breaking up the task into small steps, choosing a starting point, deciding which resources you need. There are performance related ones like that you're going to use while working, so like summarizing examples, practice questions, monitoring your understanding as you go. And then there are like the reflection parts, the strategies that help you like look back, so evaluating what worked, what didn't, what you might change. And quite a few strategies sit across more than one. So connecting new ideas to prior knowledge helps you plan, but it also helps you support your understanding during the task. So seeing where your strategy fits helps you understand how the whole SRL cycle supports learning, not just the part where you're doing the work. So you can probably see how like, again, if you're sitting at home watching this, the strategies that you might have been using or our example one in the class today, when it go across multiple of these parts of the SRL cycle. So to bring it all together, um, like we move through the entire SRL cycle, and you often do this like without being told to. You did it naturally as part of the activities. So you would have identified a learning strategy. So something you genuinely find difficult. You looked at like what's at the heart of it. So why is it challenging? That's the forethought phase, where learners notice obstacles and think ahead. You've also looked at strategies that could help. So which belongs in the performance phase, where learners choose approaches, monitor their understanding, adjust as needed, and where those strategies fit into the SRL cycle connects your choices back to planning, which is some amount of reflecting at least. So this is what SRL looks like when it becomes explicit and intentional rather than accidental. So the more you practice noticing your own learning processes, the easier it becomes to adjust, persist, make progress, not just in university, but across professional life, ongoing learning. As SRL and metacognition are both like lifelong learning skills that you'll develop and practice and engage with. They're not study hacks. They're just like the process of learning that you're getting better at and practicing. So if we're going to wrap it up today, and start reflecting on like one insight or idea that stood out to you, just like a word or short sentence is enough. Maybe it's about metacognition, SRL, strategies, noticing confusion, own learning patterns, anything like that. Well, it's something that's like an insight that we've generated or gained today. And again, if you're watching this later, have a think about that yourself. Like explicitly write it down on a bit of paper or it's just like a post-it note or somewhere that helps you just kind of note down like what is it that we've gained from today. Yeah. Explicit teaching of metacognition seems super important and easy to do. Absolutely. And I think that's probably a good insight that I take away from this as well, just generally is it is good to talk about the learning process. It's good to put into words, to verbalize it, to engage with it, to take it all from like in here or this thing that is happening and kind of shine a light on it. So as you'll see, like it kind of maps onto our learning outcomes here. Um, so anyone watching this later, uh hope that this resonated with you, even if it's not live or weren't engaging with it in the like classroom discussion. Please do like engage with the questions as well. And I hope that I guess kind of the discussion and talking about these processes a bit more explicitly put into words, grounding them into words and ideas that we can talk about, help kind of develop your own learning process, as well as allow you to kind of take them forward to working with learners going forward. So that is the end of the tutorial, and I will see you next week. Hopefully, with me remembering that the slides need to be shared and have made sure to do that. That should happen next time. If not, be sure to like prod me and like point it out in all caps if needed. Start shouting at me till I get it right.